On March 14, 2019, at 6:47 in the morning, a 34-year-old farmer named Aaron Westfall made a decision that would cost him $18,000, 3 days of planting time, and most of his confidence in modern engineering. He drove his brand-new Case IH STX 500 quad-track into the South Bottomland field. The STX 500 was not just a tractor. It was 500 horsepower distributed across 4 independent rubber tracks, each one controlled by sensors that adjusted traction 100 times per second. The dealer had called it the most advanced traction system ever installed on agricultural equipment. The brochure said it could float across ground that would swallow conventional machines. Aaron had financed $447,000 to own it. The field was wet. He knew that. But the forecast called for sun, and he had 340 acres of soybeans that needed to be in the ground before the end of the week. His father had always planted this bottom ground last, waiting until May. Aaron believed the STX 500 could handle what his father's old two-wheel drives could not. He was wrong. By 7:15 a.m., the STX 500 had sunk to its belly pan in 11 feet of saturated clay. All 4 tracks were submerged. The chassis rested on mud. The engine was still running, but the machine could not move forward or backward. The traction management system flashed errors across the digital display. Aaron called his dealer. Then he called his father. If this kind of farming story matters to you, the kind that moves slowly, examines decisions closely, and measures consequences over years instead of minutes, we'd be grateful if you subscribed. These stories are built for people who understand that equipment choices carry weight long after the purchase is signed. There's no hype here, just the truth about what happens when belief meets mud and when the newest technology faces the oldest problems. We'll be here when you come back. Aaron's father, Dennis, was 79 years old in the spring of 2019. He had been farming the same 680 acres in Audrin County, Missouri since 1964. He had bought his first tractor, a used 1950 Farmall M, for $1,200, with money saved from working nights at a grain elevator. He had built his operation one machine at a time, always buying used, always paying cash, always fixing what broke instead of replacing what worked. Dennis did not trust debt. He had seen what it did to neighbors in the 1980s, when land values collapsed and interest rates climbed to 18%. He had watched men lose everything because they believed growth required loans. He had learned that survival required caution. Aaron had learned something different. He had gone to college. He had studied agronomy and precision agriculture. He had returned to the farm in 2009 with ideas about variable rate planting, soil mapping, and equipment efficiency. He believed technology could solve problems that his father's generation had only endured. In 2014, Aaron convinced Dennis to rent an additional 240 acres from a neighbor who was retiring. The extra ground pushed their operation to 920 acres, large enough, Aaron argued, to justify modern equipment. Dennis agreed to the rental lease but refused to co-sign any loans. Aaron financed his first new tractor in 2015, a Case IH Magnum 280 with CVT transmission and auto steer. It cost $246,000. He justified the payment by calculating fuel savings, reduced operator fatigue, and faster field speeds. On paper, the numbers worked. In practice, the Magnum 280 spent more time at the dealer than Dennis's oldest tractor had in 30 years. The CVT transmission failed twice in the first 18 months. The auto steer system required software updates that left the tractor unusable for days, while the dealer waited for remote authorization from engineers in Wisconsin. The diesel exhaust fluid system clogged in cold weather. Each repair was covered under warranty, but the downtime was not. Dennis said nothing. He kept farming with his 1979 Case IH 4694, a four-wheel drive tractor he had bought used in 1991 for $28,000. It had 174 horsepower, a manual transmission, and no computers. It burned more fuel than the Magnum 280. It lacked a cab suspension, but it started every morning, and when something broke, Dennis fixed it himself in the machine shed. Aaron saw the 4694 as a relic. Dennis saw it as reliable. By 2018, Aaron's equipment payments had grown to $52,000 per year. The Magnum 280 was joined by a financed Case IH 1245 planter and a financed grain cart. Every piece of equipment was new, every piece was efficient, and every piece carried debt that required Aaron to farm faster, plant earlier, and take risks that Dennis would not have taken. The STX 500 quad track was supposed to be the final piece. Aaron ordered it in January 2019 after a dealer demonstration showed the machine pulling a 48-foot disc through wet ground without tire slip. The quad track's 4-track system promised to eliminate compaction, improve traction, and allow field work in conditions that would stop conventional tractors. The dealer called it a game changer. Aaron called it necessary. Dennis called it expensive. The STX 500 was delivered on March 1, 2019. It weighed 36 tons. It stood 9 feet tall. It cost more than Dennis had spent on equipment in his entire life. 13 days later, it was stuck. Aaron's first call went to the dealer at 7:22 a.m. The service manager listened to the description. STX 500, sunk to the chassis, south bottom field, all 4 tracks submerged, and said he would send a recovery truck within 2 hours. The truck arrived at 9:40 a.m. It was a Ford F550 with a hydraulic boom and a 20,000-pound rated winch. The operator assessed the situation, shook his head, and said the winch wasn't strong enough. He called for a second truck. The second truck arrived at 11:15 a.m. It was a larger rig with a 35,000-pound winch. The operator chained to the front of the STX 500, engaged the winch, and pulled for 6 minutes. The cable went tight. The truck's rear tires dug into the soft ground. The STX 500 did not move. The operator repositioned the truck on firmer ground and tried again. This time, the winch motor overheated and shut down. He said they would need a different approach. Aaron asked what that approach would be. The operator said he didn't know. By 1 p.m., word had spread through the county. Farmers driving past on the gravel road slowed down to look. Some stopped. No one offered advice. They simply looked at the $450,000 machine sitting motionless in the mud and then drove away. At 2:30 p.m., the dealer's service manager arrived in a Case IH Magnum 340, a 340 horsepower row crop tractor with dual rear wheels. He positioned the Magnum 340 on the field edge, ran a heavy chain to the STX 500, and attempted a straight pull. The Magnum 340's rear wheels spun. The tractor lurched forward, then stopped. The STX 500 did not move. The service manager tried pulling from a different angle. The result was the same. He shut off the Magnum 340, stepped down from the cab, and told Aaron they would need to bring in a contractor with excavation equipment. Aaron asked how much that would cost. The service manager estimated $12,000 to $15,000, depending on how long it took. Aaron sat in his truck and did not speak. At 3:45 p.m., Dennis arrived. He had been working in a machine shed 7 miles away when Aaron's wife called to tell him what had happened. Dennis loaded a heavy chain and a pair of clevis hooks into the back of his pickup, drove to the farm, and parked at the edge of the bottomland field. He walked out to where Aaron and the service manager were standing beside the stuck STX 500. He looked at the machine. He looked at the ground. He looked at the failed recovery attempts, the tire ruts from the Magnum 340, the torn sod from the winch cables. Then he turned and walked back to his pickup. At 4:10 p.m., Dennis returned driving his 1979 Case IH 4694. The 4694 was not an impressive machine by modern standards. It was 40 years old. It had 174 horsepower. It weighed 16 tons, less than half the weight of the STX 500. The cab was loud. The paint was faded. The front assist drive was engaged with a mechanical lever, not a computer. Aaron watched his father position the 46694 30 feet in front of the stuck quad track. The service manager said, "Dennis, that tractor doesn't have the weight to pull this out." Dennis did not answer. He climbed down from the cab, dragged the heavy chain through the mud, and hooked it to the STX 500's front tow point. Then he returned to the 4694, engaged the front-wheel drive, shifted into second gear low range, and let out the clutch. The 4694 moved forward slowly. The chain came tight. The front wheels dug in. The rear wheels turned steadily without spinning. The STX 500 rocked slightly, then began to move. It moved 6 inches, then a foot, then 3 feet. Dennis kept the throttle steady. The 4694's engine note never changed. The tractor continued forward at the same slow, grinding pace, pulling the STX 500 through the wet clay like a plow pulling through soil. After 8 minutes, the STX 500 was on solid ground. Dennis stopped the 4694, unhooked the chain, and drove back to his pickup without speaking. Aaron stood beside the freed STX 500 and did not know what to say. The service manager said, "I'll be damned." That evening, Aaron sat in the farmhouse kitchen with Dennis and asked the question that had been growing since the moment the 4694 pulled the STX 500 free. Why did it work? Dennis drank his coffee and thought about the answer. "Weight doesn't matter if it's in the wrong place," he said. "That quad track has all its weight on top of the tracks. When the tracks sink, the weight sits on mud. My 4694 has weight on the axles and the tires carry it through. The quad track was trying to float. I was trying to dig." Aaron said, "The dealer said the tracks would handle wet ground better than tires." Dennis nodded. "They handle wet ground fine. They don't handle mud. Mud doesn't care about your sensors." Aaron asked, "Then why did the Magnum 340 fail?" Dennis said, "Because it was pulling from the side of the field. I pulled from inside it. I put my weight where the stuck machine was. You can't pull something out of a hole if you're standing on solid ground." Aaron did not respond. Dennis set down his coffee cup. "You bought that STX because you thought it could do what I couldn't. But machines don't farm. People do. That quad track is smarter than any tractor I've ever owned, but it doesn't know mud, and it can't pull itself out." The STX 500 went back into service 3 days later, after the field dried enough to finish planting. Aaron lost 72 hours of work and paid a soil compaction specialist $4,200 to repair the damage caused by the recovery attempts. The dealer asked if the machine had malfunctioned. Aaron said no. The dealer asked if Aaron wanted to discuss additional training on operating in wet conditions. Aaron said no. He knew the problem was not the machine. Over the next 4 years, Aaron continued farming with the STX 500. The tractor performed exactly as designed. It pulled heavy implements efficiently. It reduced compaction. It covered ground faster than any tractor Dennis had ever owned. But it never went into the South Bottomland field again. Aaron learned to read the ground the way his father did, not by looking at soil maps on a screen, but by walking the field, feeling the moisture, and waiting when the ground was not ready. He learned that technology could enhance judgment, but could not replace it. In 2021, Aaron refinanced his equipment loans to reduce the monthly payments. The new terms extended the loan period from 5 years to 7. He would own the STX 500 outright in 2026, assuming nothing else went wrong. In 2022, the STX 500's DEF system failed during fall harvest. The repair cost $8,400 and took 11 days while the dealer waited for parts. Aaron finished the harvest using Dennis's 4694. In 2023, Aaron asked Dennis if he had ever considered selling the 4694. Dennis said, "Why would I?" Aaron said, "It's 44 years old. Parts are hard to find. It burns twice the fuel my equipment does." Dennis said, "It also starts every time I turn the key, and it doesn't care if the DEF system freezes." Aaron said, "You could get $15,000 for it at auction." Dennis said, "I paid $28,000 for it in 1991. I've spent maybe $12,000 on repairs since then. That's $40,000 over 32 years. Your STX payment is $52,000 every year. You tell me which one's expensive." Aaron did not have an answer. That winter, Dennis rebuilt the 4694's transmission in his machine shed. The parts cost $2,700. The labor took him 3 weeks, working alone in the evenings. When he was finished, he test drove the tractor across the frozen South Bottomland field, the same field where the STX 500 had been stuck 4 years earlier. The 4694 ran smoothly. In March 2024, 5 years after the STX 500 had sunk into the Missouri mud, Aaron made a different kind of decision. He did not trade the STX 500. He did not buy another new tractor. Instead, he stopped planting the South Bottomland field in early spring. He waited until the ground was dry, the way Dennis had always done. The delay cost him 4 days of ideal planting weather, but it saved him the risk of getting stuck again. And it saved him the cost of learning the same lesson twice. The STX 500 still sits in Aaron's equipment shed. It is worth approximately $240,000 according to the most recent auction reports, nearly half what he paid for it 5 years ago. He still owes $186,000 on the loan. The 4694 still sits in Dennis's shed. It is worth approximately $18,000 according to the same auction reports. Dennis owns it outright and has no plans to sell. On quiet evenings, when the field work is done and the equipment is parked, Aaron sometimes walks out to the shed where the STX 500 is stored. He looks at the machine, its 4 massive tracks, its enclosed cab, its digital displays, and he thinks about the morning it could not move. He thinks about the recovery trucks that failed. He thinks about the dealer's service tractor that spun its wheels. He thinks about his father's 40-year-old 4694 pulling the $450,000 machine out of the mud in 8 minutes. And he thinks about what the dealer had said when the STX 500 was delivered. This tractor can handle anything. The dealer had been wrong. Not because the STX 500 was poorly built, not because the technology was flawed, but because handling anything requires more than horsepower and sensors. It requires understanding the ground. It requires knowing when to move and when to wait. It requires the kind of judgment that comes from decades of watching machines succeed and fail. Dennis had that judgment. The STX 500 did not. In the years since the stuck quad track, other farmers in Audrin County have bought similar machines. Some have had success, some have not. The difference is rarely the equipment. One neighbor bought a Case IH Steiger 620 in 2020, 692 horsepower, the largest tractor Case IH builds. He used it to farm 2,400 acres and never had a problem. But he also never rushed planting. He waited for the ground to dry. He planned his season around conditions, not calendars. Another neighbor bought a smaller quad track in 2021 and got it stuck 3 times in the first year. Each time, he called a contractor to extract it. Each time, the cost exceeded $10,000. After the third incident, he traded the quad track for a conventional 4-wheel drive and accepted the loss. The equipment was the same. The outcomes were different. Aaron learned this slowly. He learned it through the $18,000 recovery cost. He learned it through the delayed planting seasons. He learned it through the conversations with his father, who never said, "I told you so," but didn't need to. Most of all, he learned it by watching the 4694 continue working year after year, pulling loads that newer tractors struggled with, starting in cold weather that left modern machines flashing error codes and costing almost nothing to maintain because Dennis understood every bolt and bearing. The 4694 was not better than the STX 500 in any measurable category. It was slower, it was louder, it was less efficient, but it was predictable. And in farming, predictability is worth more than performance. By 2025, Aaron had stopped comparing his equipment to his father's. He had stopped calculating efficiency gains and fuel savings. He had stopped justifying purchases with spreadsheets that projected returns over 5-year periods. Instead, he started asking a different question. Can I afford to be wrong? The STX 500 had taught him that the cost of being wrong was not just the purchase price. It was the recovery. It was the lost time. It was the realization that the most advanced machine ever built could still be defeated by 11 feet of Missouri mud. And it was the knowledge that his father's 40-year-old tractor, the one Aaron had dismissed as outdated, had succeeded where modern engineering had failed. That knowledge carried weight. In the spring of 2025, Aaron planted the South Bottomland field on May 3rd, 3 weeks later than he would have planted it in 2019. The ground was dry. The STX 500 performed flawlessly. The soybeans emerged evenly and yielded 58 bushels per acre. His father planted the same field the same day, using the 4694 to pull a disc he had owned since 1987. The tractor ran for 9 hours without issue. When Dennis parked it that evening, he checked the oil, greased the fittings, and walked back to the house. Aaron watched from his truck. He thought about the day the STX 500 had been stuck. He thought about the dealer's promises and the loan documents and the belief that newer meant better. And he thought about his father driving the 4694 into the mud, hooking a chain, and pulling the impossible out of the ground without hesitation. That moment had not made Aaron's equipment worthless, but it had made it smaller. The STX 500 is still the most powerful tractor Aaron owns. It is still the most technologically advanced. It is still the most expensive, but it is no longer the most trusted. That title belongs to a 46-year-old Case IH 4694 with faded paint, a manual transmission, and 174 horsepower. A tractor that has never promised anything except to start when asked and pull when needed. On March 14, 2026, exactly 7 years after the STX 500 had been stuck in the South Bottomland field, Aaron made the final payment on the loan. He now owned the tractor outright. It had cost him $447,000 in principal, $63,000 in interest, $31,000 in repairs, and 7 years of monthly payments that had forced him to farm faster, plant earlier, and take risks he would not have otherwise taken. The 4694 cost Dennis $28,000 in 1991 and approximately $19,000 in repairs over 34 years of ownership. Aaron did the math. The STX 500 had cost him $541,000. The 46694 had cost Dennis $47,000. The STX 500 could pull heavier loads. It could cover more ground. It could operate in conditions the 4694 never could. But it had also been stuck in the mud for 3 days while the 4694 pulled it free. That fact would never change. Aaron still owns the STX 500. He still uses it. He still believes it is a good tractor, but he no longer believes it is irreplaceable. And on the mornings when the ground is soft and the forecast is uncertain, he does not call the dealer for advice. He calls his father. Dennis still owns the 4694. He still maintains it himself. He still refuses to finance equipment. And when younger farmers ask him why he keeps running a tractor that is older than most of their children, he gives the same answer he gave Aaron 7 years ago: because it works. That is not nostalgia. That is not stubbornness. That is the sound of a man who learned, long before spreadsheets and sensors, that the best machine is not the one that does the most. It is the one that does not fail when you need it most. The STX 500 sits in Aaron's shed tonight, clean and ready for spring. Its tracks are greased, its fuel tanks are full, its computers are updated. The 4694 sits in Dennis's shed, covered in dust from a day's work. Its engine is warm, its transmission fluid is fresh, its odometer reads 14,240 hours. Both tractors will be in the field tomorrow, but only one of them has ever pulled the other out of the mud, and that is the story no salesman will ever tell.